get started. So I was saying to Catherine before, maybe people heard it was a boring topic this morning, but it's we're going to talk a little bit about purity and impurities, which is it's not so much that it's boring. It's just that it's not like super relevant in our day, but also I felt like, we've done chapters 1 through 8 and we haven't skipped any Mishnayot. I think maybe we skipped one where I thought, oh, good, there's Ruth. Where I thought, this is like a little dicey. We don't need to work on this one, but we're almost done. We've gone, chapter 1 to 8 and there's only 9 chapters. So I figured, well, we shouldn't skip things now. We should just keep plugging along. So I'll share my screen. Okay. So this is where we were last week. We are in this chapter. Chapter 8 is all about arguments between, I use the word arguments, but we know that they're not actually, sort of tense arguments, more like halachic or Torah-based arguments between Hillel and Shammai, two of our great teachers, and their schools and their students who sort of follow after them. So we studied last week this first Mishnah about whether or not we say the blessing over the wine or we say the blessing over the day. And we talked about sort of what the difference is and how this added paragraph kind of threw us maybe a little bit because we thought, oh, well, that's about the day. But actually what we were talking about was the bracha. And we know that on Friday night, we first bless the wine and then we bless the day. We had quite a long discussion about whether people felt like that was, that resonated with them or not, that the day would come or that the wine would come before the day. We talked about this principle called Tadir V'Sheno Tadir Kodem, which is that we always tend to go with the regular before the irregular. So actually that argument made sense. So that's kind of where we ended last time. And so now we're going to look at this next Mishnah about hand washing. And like I said, when I started, these next couple are about have a lot to do with ritual purity and impurity. And I just want to clarify right off the bat that we're not talking about cleanliness in the way that we think about cleanliness today. We're not thinking about it like I was studying with my chavruta who you met, Danny, and I sort of like jokingly or maybe casually use the word dirty. And he said, well, I wouldn't use the word dirty, with your class. And I said, that's definitely true. Thank you for pointing that out. It's not dirt, right? We're not worried about something being dirty. We're worried about some sort of impurity that causes something else to be impure. And it's a hard concept to really understand because we really don't talk about it so much anymore. The most common usage of it is around the mikvah and menstruation. So that you use the mikvah in order to sort of reset or purify yourself. We also use the mikvah for other things though, right? Like we use the mikvah before we get married as a custom, or we use the mikvah for conversion. And certainly that's not a pure and impure sort of distinction. So just to know that that's kind of what we're talking about, but that it's a little bit hard to grasp, today. Okay, so here we go. Beit Shammai Omrim, Notlim layadayim ve'achar kach mozgim et hakos, uveit Hillel omrim mozgim et hakos ve'achar kach notlim layadayim. So Beit Shammai starts with Beit Shammai's argument first, which we know we usually side with Beit Hillel. More commonly, Beit Shammai often takes the more strict opinion. So Beit Shammai says that they wash their hands and then they pour their cup of wine. In this case, as you remember, we use the word mozgim, which is to actually mix, right? They're putting water in. And somebody asked the question last week, can you mix on Shabbat? And I said, my gut says yes, but I'll double check. And the answer is yes, you can mix on Shabbat. It was the only way they were able to make wine. And it's not one of the melachot. It's not one of the things on Shabbat that you're not allowed to do. So they would pour their cup of wine, Beit Shammai is suggesting that first they wash their hands and then they pour their cup of wine. And Beit Hillel says the opposite. They pour their cup of wine and then they wash their hands. Now, just as a reminder, you all probably know this, but the order that we go with now, right, is candles and then wine and then hand washing and then motzi for bread. They're talking about Friday night. They're talking about the order of the rituals before we eat a meal. And I also just want to point out here that it says here notlin yadayim, and I wanted to show you that this is the ritual that we're all used to, nitilat yadayim, right? Where we sometimes it might mean it literally means like to take your hands, but it also can mean to lift up. So can you see me right now? You can see me on the screen, right? So you would wash on each side, and then you might see some people go like this to lift their hands. It's literally so that you know that the water has covered like all parts of your hand. When you lift it up, the water kind of drips down, and you know that you've gotten the tips of your fingers, the palms, right? You've gotten your whole hand. And it might, again, coming back to what we started with, you might think that you're doing it for cleanliness reasons because you're about to eat, and it would make sense that you wash your hands, but really this is a ritual that's around purity and impurity, often associated with bread. So Beit Shammai says they wash and then they pour, and Beit Hillel says they pour and then they wash. Now, what you need to know about this impurity and impurity rules is super, super complicated, but I want to try to boil it down to sort of the most basic. And then if you have questions, I'll try to answer them. It's a year-long course, Tuma and Tahara, which is impure and purity laws. It's a year-long class that I've never taken. So it's really, really tricky. But basically, there are 6 different levels of Tuma. There's 6 different levels of impurities. So you have like the most impure, which is even the mikvah can't sort of cure you of that, or can't purify you from that level of impurity. And then you have things that are less problematic. So an example would be your body, like your hand touches a dead person. So then you are impure and you'd have to go to the mikvah. Another level would be you're holding some sort of a vessel in your hand that touches a dead body. And then the vessel is impure, but you yourself have not experienced impurities. And then there's a level which is really hard to grasp, which is you're holding a vessel, you touch a dead body, and then somehow that vessel ends up in the thing that you're eating, right? And then your food is impure, right? You're all making this face like, what are you talking about? This is just how it's explained in the Gemara, and it's very complicated. So, in essence, it's talking about whether you yourself are actually needing to sort of purify yourself. And the hands are actually a level of impurity that is pretty low, meaning to say that it's not such a big deal, that we understand that our hands are going to be touching things all the time and have the chance of being impure. And so because of that, we do this ritual of nitilat yadayim to be free of any impurities that may have touched our hands. Now, we're not going around touching dead people, obviously, so that's not an issue. But whatever else in the world that we might be touching that might be impure, we wash our hands before we eat in order to purify them. And something else, which we're going to need to know for the next Mishnah, is that liquid causes a higher level of impurity. So if your hands are wet, this is the problem. And so this is kind of what they're talking about in this Mishnah, believe it or not, right? Because they're afraid that if you wash your hands and then you touch the cup of wine, if some of the wine spilled out, the wine would then be impurified because the wine is sort of interacting with the wetness of your hands. Does anybody here care about any of what I just said? Maybe, probably not, right? Exactly. But this is what they're talking about, okay? So they're talking about the order of which you do things in order to avoid impurity. So essentially, Beit Shammai says they first wash their hands in order to purify them, and only afterwards they pour the cup of wine. He fears that if they pour before the hands are washed and purified, some of the wine might get on the outside of the cup, and the person drinking touches the cup will be impure, and that causes the whole cup itself to be impure. Whereas Beit Hillel says that he should pour first and then wash his hands. And it seems that they hold that the hands should be washed immediately before food, right? So essentially they agree in that you have to wash your hands before you eat. And the order is sort of what I just said, right? It has to do with wine dripping out and your hands being impure, etc. Again, we know that today the order is we start with the nair, we start with the candles. We then immediately do wine if we're sort of sitting down to our meal, or there might be a break, and then we wash our hands, and then we do hamotzi. Okay, questions? You all look riveted by that Mishnah. Yes, Ruth, you can make sure you unmute yourself.
Why do people take off their rings before they wash their hands?
That's a great question. So it's similar to when you go to the mikveh and you're supposed to even remove your nail polish. There's not supposed to be any barrier essentially between the water being able to get into every crevice of your body, like in the mikveh. And it's the same is true for your hands. It's the same reason why you would take off your ring if you were wrapping tefillin. Tefillin is also supposed to be exactly next to your skin, so there's no sort of barrier between the ritual object and your hands or your body. You'll see people take off their watch or their rings. You wouldn't put if you were wearing a baseball cap, you wouldn't put your tefillin over your baseball cap. It's sort of the same principle. So when you go to the mikveh, you, depending on which mikveh, I'm not sure that the San Francisco, maybe Betsy's around, she can tell us whether the San Francisco mikveh would make you take off your nail polish. Would they make you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me rephrase it. So when I'm telling people how to prepare, I encourage them to do that. But I also know that, if there's certain issues about whether the mikveh is the conversion is going to be halakhic anyway, in terms of conversion, but in terms of everything, women who come regularly, they'll take it off. The cool thing is if you have gel nails, they're considered permanent. So then you don't have to change them at all.
Oh, like acrylics. Look at you.
Whatever, the one that's long lasting and expensive to put on.
Yeah.
I have a story because my friend's daughter was getting married. I don't know if you remember her, Betsy, Jessica Harris Neal. Anyway, I lived right down the street from the mikveh, and she got there and was told that she had to take her nail polish off. And I went home and got some nail polish removers so she could do it.
Yeah, I think they're less strict. Oh, go ahead, Betsy.
I was just going to say, I don't know why she would have had to do that unless it was recent, because usually normal circumstances, all that stuff is there, right?
Well,
I mean, people do that.
Yeah.
This was a long time ago,
This
right?
was a while ago. This was about 5 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, that's unusual, but anyway, interesting that you remember it.
But Betsy raises an interesting point, which is that nowadays the mikveh isn't only used for purity reasons, right? So in the sense of the word that we're talking about it this morning, some women will go before their wedding, and that's not a halachic requirement. And so the mikveh may not require you to take your nail polish off for a wedding because it's more of a ritual that you're sort of choosing to do. You're shaking your head now.
I don't know for sure. Maybe you're right, but I thought the first time a woman is commanded to go is as a bride. So
Sorry,
I think if you're following orthodoxy, I think it is an expectation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it probably depends on the mikveh. The mikveh that I went to was through a conservative synagogue in Philadelphia before my wedding, so they were not that strict. I didn't have. Anyway, whatever. People it's not necessarily something you think about, right? Oh, let's make sure I get my nails done after the mikveh. But anyway, that's a good question. Okay, so that's number 2. Any other questions on that?
Well, nowadays, you don't touch a body normally if you're doing an autopsy or if you're cleaning the body, ritually, directly, because people wear surgical gloves, or I don't know if I'm sure they have a ruling about that, but it wouldn't be that you touch the body directly.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, I think it's very unusual that you would find yourself in this kind of situation. Betsy.
To speak to what Arnie said, I've participated in a couple of taharot at a Sinai, and you do ritual hand wash without a blessing at the beginning of the process and another one at the end. And I think you do say the blessing then of Nitilat Yadayim. I don't remember for sure, but you definitely don't have to go to the mikveh. And I always found that interesting that that's not part of it, because it's not like that you came upon it, perhaps. I think it's something about if you come upon it in an unnatural situation.
Right, if you're, well, yeah, or I could imagine a scenario like people, mostly died in their homes, right? So if you woke up, God forbid, next to a dead body, right? Like you might find yourself in that situation and you have no choice but to touch. I mean, and you might not be next to mikvah waters, right? Like right now, when we do netilat yadayim on Shabbat, we just run the water from the sink into a cup, and that's not necessarily the waters that they were talking about, right? We're talking about mikvah waters, so or waters that are coming from a pure water source. So, Dara.
No, I just wanted to say, like what Ernie brought up. I mean, you said this is not really relevant, but it is relevant for people who do autopsies. Or, I mean, it reminds me. So I've had some training in pathology, and of course we wear gloves when we do autopsies and so on. But I remember when I was in medical school and we were doing, gross anatomy, and you dissect cadavers, and we had some foreign teachers who came to teach, and there was someone from Germany who had ridiculed us for wearing gloves and said, you need to actually touch to feel, the different structures with your hands. And that's the way he was trained. But of course we didn't do that. But, in not too distant a past, people were actually, using their hands when they did dissections.
Yeah, and we take very careful care of our dead in the Jewish tradition, right? We wash and then wrap in shrouds, and I guess it's an interesting question to ask, like why you would wear gloves, right? Like after you wash the body is theoretically clean. I mean, so I think it's just a comfort level and sort of a societal norm that when you're dealing with medical situations like that you wear gloves. But if you really think about it, I don't know. I mean, it might freak you out a little bit depending on your level of comfort, but I could see a situation where Dara, what we're talking about is not necessarily like that people might feel comfortable to not wear gloves. Yeah, Marcia.
Actually, when I worked in the ICU, which was quite a few years ago, we didn't even wear gloves when we drew blood. When we put in IVs, this all kind of started during the AIDS epidemic, where people started wearing gloves. So I remember hearing about this stuff and thinking, oh my God, what they're really telling me is I shouldn't go to shul because I participated in a code blue and the person died. And I found that very actually to be told that I couldn't be part of the community because I had participated in something that was kind of traumatic for me. So wearing gloves is actually fairly new in the scheme of things. And this was really problematic for me. This whole notion of you because you couldn't go to the synagogue until you went to the mikvah. Well, I couldn't go to the mikvah that often anyway. Just that point.
Sure.
The other point I'm wondering from Betsy is, what if you can't get your wedding ring off?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Everything's lenient. I mean, certainly I'm not like the person who's all strict about anything. If people can't get their ring off, I just tell them to try to wiggle it while they're in the water so that everything on their finger gets exposure, Like, usually you can slide it up and down between the top and your knuckles. So it's just like move it. And so people do that. Or if people have piercings that like they haven't taken out in a long time, those are considered permanent. They don't have to deal with it. But before I knew that, in my earlier days of doing this, people would go across the street to the hardware store and get like an earring cut off or something when they couldn't get it out. And then I was very relieved to know that people didn't need to, both because it might have been important to them and also it hurt. But you can fudge things, but the ideal is to be nothing separating you from the water, not contacts, not jewelry, not whatever. Not even if you have an Invisalign, you take it out for the immersion.
Yeah. Thank you. And just another point, Marcia, about what you were saying in terms of gloves or no gloves. Right now during COVID, they're actually not. Most funeral homes are not doing tahara, are not doing the washing and the wrapping of the body in the way that they used to because of sort of exposure and at least I should say in California, in San Francisco and in Los Angeles. I know that they're on hold for that. Yeah, Betsy.
Even if someone did not die of COVID?
No. So for COVID, if they know that somebody died of COVID, they're not. That's what I mean. Yeah, because we just don't know enough about this disease as to say whether or not that would be problematic for people who are in the room post-mortem. So, and gloves don't relieve you of that, and nothing. So anyway, that's just another point. Okay, great. Let's move on.
Coming back to the issue of washing the hands and having the wine and the Hillel Shammai difference, the point is that both of them require washing the hands before the motzi, before you actually eat anything.
That's right.
And when you drink wine, you're drinking from a cup. You're not touching it with your hand. So the important thing is to wash your hands before you eat.
That's right. And then the difference in their arguments is whether or not they each think that the wetness of your hands or the impurities of your hands could impurify the wine. And Beit Shammai always takes the stricter opinion that we know, right? And so he says that you should be worried about that, and you should be worried about the wine being impurified potentially. Whereas Beit Hillel says it's not really an issue. Even if wine dripped outside of the cup and it touched your hands, that doesn't mean that the wine that's inside the cup is necessarily impure, and so we don't worry about it. But yes, you're right. They agree. They often do agree on one thing, right? They're usually agreeing on the same on the issue, but then they kind of take a different approach to the issue. So yes, they agree that that hand washing is necessary before bread and before eating. All right, let's move on to our next one. This is okay. Beit Shammai omrim mikaneach yadav b'mapa umaniach al hashulchan uVeit Hillel omrim al hakeset. So this is pretty straightforward, but let's just set the scene. Beit Shammai says he wipes his hands, or would wipe his hand with a towel and then place it on the table. And Beit Hillel says that he would place it on the cushion. So just to set the scene, there's two, yeah, exactly, what? There are two ways to think about this. And it might change your perception a little bit. The first way is that you're sitting down to a meal, and the table is set with some sort of a tablecloth, and you're likely sitting on a cushion, right? Because we've talked about in previous Mishnayot that if you're actually sitting down to a meal, there's a level of comfort and that you might recline either direction. And really to be sitting at a meal means that you are sort of comfortable and you're seated and you're there for quite a while. This isn't just, go into the, Denny's and have a 15-minute breakfast. It's like we're talking about a sit-down meal where you're there for an extended period of time. The question is, which is raised in the commentaries, is that there was also this this tradition, or I guess like it happened that you would get a wet paper towel or a wet towelette kind of a thing in between every meal. And so at first it might look like that's what you're talking about, right? That you want to think about where you set that wet towel, because before in the Mishnah before we talked about the fact that liquids can have a higher level of, or sort of more risky in the realm of impurities. And so you wouldn't want to just throw your wet towel on the table, because the table's where you eat. But we notice in the, but ultimately the commentators think it's a little bit goes back and forth, is that this is specific to talking about netilat yadayim. So it's not necessarily, we're not talking about this sort of in between every course, washing your hands with a wet towel. We're actually talking about netilat yadayim as the ritual. And so if that's the case, here's the argument. So Beit Shammai says he wipes his hand with a towel and he puts it on the table, and Beit Hillel says on the cushion. So we have to understand that what Beit Shammai is would be afraid. Well, I'll ask you, what's the issue here for Beit Shammai? Beit Shammai says netilat yadayim, say the bracha, and put it on the towel and put it on the table. Yeah, Marcia, you're muted. Oh no, okay. So Beit Shammai is ultimately saying that he's not concerned about the table as being impure, right? We assume that something that we're eating off of is pure enough to sort of, we're able to put our napkin down and nothing's going to happen. And Beit Hillel says you should probably put it on the cushion, because you don't want to sort of take your impurity towel, if you will, and put it on the place that you're eating. And ultimately, Beit Hillel, we in this argument, we side with Beit Hillel. It's pretty straightforward. Any questions about that? It's a bit, I mean, it's just about a bit strange. The big question is the table impure or is the table pure? And the assumption is that, you know, you could, it seems like Beit Hillel is worried about sort of impurifying the table and then ultimately impurifying your food. Yeah, Catherine.
But couldn't it also be that the towel has residue of the impurity from washing your hands?
Definitely. So that's another reason why Beit Hillel may say put it on the cushion. And also we know the wetness, right? We don't like the wet, again, the wetness sort of carries a higher level. And so better to put it on your seat or next to you than to put it on your table, which actually, if you think about it now, kind of makes sense, right? You know, you maybe don't throw your dirty towels on the table while you're eating. But anyway, that's Mishnah 3. Yeah, Dara.
It just seems to me that Hillel is more strict in this case, because he's Shammai is, or Beit Shammai is assuming that the table is pure, and that, I mean, it seems to me that the table, putting it on the table where your food is, would provide more risk of transmission of impurity than putting it on the cushion where you're sitting. That's, maybe I'm misunderstanding it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yes, except that I think you're right in some regard, except that I guess Beit Shammai, yes, so Beit Shammai's not worried that the table's impure and Beit Hillel is. So I guess, yeah, I guess in this case that you could say that Beit Shammai is taking a stricter opinion, though. I'm sorry, that Beit Hillel is taking a stricter opinion. Yeah, I sort of could read it either way, depending on what the issue is. But I think the issue is the table is the table and the food. Yeah, Sandra.
Well, it seems like today we're bypassing the whole issue. Most people do the hand washing in a different location.
That's right.
They have the special cup, the 3-handled cup, and the towel, and then people leave the table to wash hands and then come back.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I should have said that at the beginning when I was setting the scene. So you have to imagine kind of like Pesach, that they're passing the bowl around. You know how you pass, I don't know if that happens, but if it's very big, you often will pass the bowl around. And that's probably how they were doing it. So then the question is, what do you do with your towel? And in our case, actually, we probably pass the towel from person to person to person. And we all just share, right? Maybe not post-COVID. I think a lot of our rituals are going to change, but before I could imagine the scenario where you get the bowl, you have your wash cup, you do a little, you wash it, and then you pass the whole thing to the next person, and they do that in the towel. So yeah, good point. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Yeah, this one's a bit dry. Okay, let's keep going. Beit Shammai Omrim. מכבדים את הבית ואחר כך נוטלים לידיים, ובית הלל אומרים נוטלים לידיים ואחר כך מכבדים את הבית. So Beit Shammai says that after the meal they sweep the floor and then they wash their hands, and Beit Hillel says they wash their hands and then they sweep the floor. So what are they talking about here? The assumption is that people did not eat with fork and knife, right? People ate with their hands. That's the assumption. There was not flatware, and there certainly wasn't flatware to choose from like we have now. Okay. We didn't worry about for forks and knives, milchek and fleishek, right? You just use your hands. And assuming because of your using your hands, things would end up on the floor much more than they would now. So it actually says, did it say table? Shulchan, I thought it said. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Anyway, the idea was that after the meal, they would collect whatever fell on the floor, and actually that these are things that they would eat, right? Because they were saving sort of every piece of food. Food was scarce in a different way than it is now. And so they would eat their meal, and then they would collect whatever was dropped and whatever was left over, and they would actually eat these segments. So the issue here is again about this wetness and the impurity of your hands when you're collecting the things that you're going to then have to eat. So Beit Shammai says you would sweep the floor and then you would wash your hands so that you wouldn't have to worry about your wet hands touching the sort of leftover bread pieces that you might eat. And Beit Hillel says that they wash their hands first because you sort of end your meal and then you wash your hands and then you sweep the floor. Interestingly, this is a Mishnah where we paskin, where we side, the halacha goes with Shammai. Okay, I don't know if that, to me, that makes sense, right? Shammai sort of has the impurity thing in mind, and then, but there's some underlying questions also. So, for example, would there be a kazait, an olive-sized amount of food left? So we talked about kazait as being an olive size, and that kind of is what symbolizes something that's legitimately, I don't know, a meal or considered something that you need to say a bracha over. So Beit Shammai would say yes, that there is enough, and that's why he feels like it's important to make sure that we treat it as if it's food that we can eat later. Beit Hillel would say probably there's not enough. It's just crumbs, and it's not necessarily a problem. But so that's kind of that's that argument. Question, yeah, Catherine.
No, it's just more of a comment. I think, if I was reading this without that explanation and historical context in terms of, picking up food off the floor, which I never would have guessed, I would have thought it had something to do with moving from purity to, from holiness to unholiness, maybe, or from, like Havdalah, where you're purified.
Yeah, a separation between.
You're separated, and then sweeping the floor is like an everyday activity.
Right.
But
right.
I'm not making that argument if that's not what.
No, you can listen. You can be a commentator as well, but right. So you're sort of thinking like so you would side with Hillel. You would think we would side with Hillel because washing your hands kind of ends the meal, and then the sweeping the floor is the after the fact. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, it's like a division of going back to work, your everyday life, and like a Shabbat meal is sort of like your oasis within the oasis too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think it's, in one of the commentaries that I was reading, it says that that according to Beit Shammai, if you sweep first and then wash, it would prevent the crumbs from being ruined by the water, right? And that's kind of a simplistic, that doesn't necessarily, to me anyway, it doesn't indicate purity or impurity. It's just talking about like, you don't want to touch bread with wet hands, right? Because then you're ruining what's left and you won't have that to be able to eat it later. So you could sort of read out the pure and impure and talk about what the tachlis of it is, what it actually means and how it actually works for us. But yes, you're right. Nowadays, the sweeping of the floor would be routine and for sort of logistical purposes, not for saving the food that was on the floor, because we know that we wouldn't eat food off the floor typically.
Maybe we should.
Maybe we should.
Just kidding.
Yeah. So Beit Hillel says that the first thing that they do is wash their hands, and then they say birkat immediately. Typically, in the Mishnah, it was only really mandatory to say birkat to wash one's hand. In the Mishnah, it was considered mandatory to wash your hands before saying birkat hamazon. And so that's why the question of like how much food is actually on the floor and whether you're going to eat it immediately. So if it's enough food that's a kazait, it's as much as an olive's worth, and then you're going to eat it, then washing your hands before you would want to wash your hands before because you then want to eat that food. Whereas Beit Shammai is saying, well, you might not eat it immediately. And so you wouldn't want to ruin it. So, okay. Questions? All right. We are now going to talk a little bit about Havdalah and about something a little bit more relevant to our lives. I knew we'd get there eventually. So again, we're sticking with Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, talking about the various blessings that we recite during Havdalah. And we know that the Havdalah blessings, as you were just saying a second ago, separate the Shabbat from the rest of the week. And what we're talking about specifically here is the case where people are having a meal on a Saturday night at nightfall. And so, Sudat Shlishi, like the third sort of small meal of the day. And they want to combine Birkat Hamazon and Havdalah because they only have 1 cup of wine. Okay, so you traditionally, I shouldn't say traditionally, in the time of the Mishnah, you were saying Birkat Hamazon over the kos. You were saying the Birkat over the wine. Some people do that now, some people don't. But there was a cup of wine associated with Birkat Hamazon. We know that the wine came at the end of the meal for this purpose. And so the question is, if you are saying Birkat Hamazon into Havdalah, or they're very, very close and you only have 1 cup of wine, what are we going to do? Before we get there, I wanted to just show you a piece of Rambam, a piece of the Mishnah Torah, which talks about sort of why are we even, what are we doing what is the point of even Kiddush and Havdalah in the first place? So it says it's a positive duty, a positive mitzvah to express the sanctity of Shabbat in words, because it is written in the Torah, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho, that you remember to sanctify the Shabbat day. That is to say, remember in terms of praise and sanctification. One should remember it at its beginning and its conclusion by reciting the Kiddush when the Shabbat begins, and Havdalah when it ends. So that is sort of how the Rambam explains why we're doing Kiddush at the beginning of Shabbat and why we do Kiddush at the end of Shabbat, kind of bookending Shabbat with the Kiddush from the Torah line of Zachor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho. So that's where it comes from, right? What is Havdalah anyway? Havdalah is this the bookending of blessing the wine and of blessing Shabbat. So Beit Shammai says, Beit Shammai omrim ner umazon uvsamim v'havdalah. So Beit Shammai says the order is ner, candle, birkat hamazon, spices, and Havdalah. Beit Hillel omrim ner uvsamim umazon v'havdalah. But Beit Hillel says candle, spices, birkat hamazon, and Havdalah. Now, what do you notice? Neither of these is what we do, right? Right? Like if you were to think about it in terms of the scene that I set, right? The way that the Mishnah is talking about it, where you want to go from your Sudat Shlishi into Havdalah, what we would do now is we would do Sudat Shlishi, then we would do Birkat Hamazon, and then we would do the rest of it, right? And here they sort of have Birkat Hamazon out of order, and they also have the candle out of order. So in beginning Shabbat, we know that we start with the ner, right? The very first thing that we do on Shabbat is we light the candles because we need the candles for light, right? We need the candles to do the rest of the things that we're going to do, and we're sort of benefiting from that Shabbat light. But that's not the case with Havdalah, right? The Havdalah candle usually comes later after we bless the Shabbat, because you're not supposed to light the candle on Shabbat. And so the wine signifies that Shabbat is over, and then the candle is lit or is blessed over, right? So Beit Shammai holds that the candle's blessing comes first, because as soon as the candle is lit, they immediately benefit from this candle's light. Then they would do Birkat Hamazon in order to be able to see, because they've already finished eating. And then finally they bless over the spices and the Havdalah. They put those two blessings together. Beit Hillel says, slightly different, that since the candle and the spices are both relatively short blessings, they sort of go together at the beginning. And then he moves the blessing over the spices to join with the blessings over the candle. And then he recites Birkat Hamazon and Havdalah. Havdalah being that very last bracha, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, right? The separation between the holiness and the chol. Yes, Catherine. You're muted though, Catherine.
I'm sorry, I'm confused. So Birkat Hamazon, is that the same as Borei Pri Hagafen?
So that's the question, right? Well, no, sorry. So that is sort of the question, which is that Birkat Hamazon is relating to Sudat Shlishi, is relating to the meal before. And you're right, I should have pointed this out. What they assume is that Birkat Hamazon comes at the end of wine. I'm sorry, wine comes at the end of Birkat Hamazon. So you would read it, candle, Birkat Hamazon / wine. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Go together. Yes. So because we know that in the times in the Mishnah, they said Birkat Hamazon over the wine, so that the wine comes at the very end of Birkat Hamazon. So if you were to read it that way, I should maybe put it there so it's more clear. So Beit Shammai says the proper order is candle, Birkat Hamazon, wine, in parentheses, like this. And the same thing here. Like that. And Havdalah. Yeah? Okay. And we know that neither of those is what we do now, right? Which is strange, but that's just their argument. Any other questions about that? Because the next part of the Mishnah is kind of a different, it's not a totally different topic, but it's a little bit sort of unrelated to this. It's about the bracha. Any questions about the wine and the order?
Well, again, I'm sort of like stupefied, sorry.
No,
But why, I mean, I'm sorry, we do it the way Beit Hillel says, because why?
We actually, right now, currently.
Well, we don't do it that way.
We don't do it either way. We don't do it either. Why? Because later rabbis said it didn't make any sense. The Rambam said it didn't. The Rambam said essentially that you would do wine, bisamim, candle, right, ner, and then havdalah, and that you would do something that you don't. You would do the Birkat Hamazon with the wine at the end. That bracha on the wine would act as the bracha for starting Havdalah, and then you would carry on with the things that we do the way.
Seems like they ought to add that in here somewhere, even though I understand it was
like an amendment to the Mishnah. Like, and by the way,
exactly.
Essentially what the Mishnah Torah is, and all the codes that come later are amendments to the Mishnah, right? They're sort of like, this is what we thought was going to happen, and actually it's not going to happen that way at all. The reason for why the Rambam goes that way is a great question. I don't know exactly why he chooses this, but
okay. Well, that's enough of an explanation. I'm not gonna make you, but
no, that's good.
Drop a footnote here.
All right. So now this is kind of interesting. So now we have another argument about the bracha that we say at the end. So Beit Shammai omrim shibara meor ha'esh, and Uveit Hillel omrim borei meorei ha'esh. So when you lift your when you light the candle, and you might lift your hands to see the dirt under your fingernails as a custom. You might bend your fingers like this to see the shadow, right? You're supposed to be benefiting from the light that's coming from the Havdalah candle in some way, in order to check that. And in order to check that you're benefiting from the light, you use your fingernails, or sometimes people will hold the hands up like this to sort of signify that there's some benefit coming from that Havdalah candle. And we know that we go with Beit Hillel, but it's an interesting argument, right? Because one of them says, Beit Shammai says, who created the light of fire? So Beit Shammai is talking about the past, right? This may be eternal fire. And Beit Hillel says that God creates, is like constantly creating fire, right? Over and over. And he uses it in the present tense language, borei meorei ha'esh, which is what we do today. We could just leave it at that, right? We could just say, okay, so one's positive, one's present, and one's past. That's kind of an interesting argument, and I'm just curious if anybody has any thoughts on, which one you prefer, or now having heard both, like if one makes more sense to you, or if not, we can just, we can leave it, but just any thoughts?
Well, we put out the light in Havdalah. So Shammai is right. It is in the past, because
yeah, so if you take it quite literally to what the ritual of Havdalah is, you light the light and then you extinguish the light, and so the light that was used was in the past. Great, I like that. Yeah, Catherine?
But I think, the idea that God is constantly creating in our world, I think the other view is God created the world and then stepped back and absented himself. But the idea that God is still involved in our world and creating is much more comforting, you know, to the idea that we're not alone. We're not alone in this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you could also see Beit Shammai as feeling that way, in that Beit Shammai says God created the original light and is still creating, right? But it just doesn't, the bracha just doesn't say that, but maybe it's implied from Beit Shammai. But yeah, I like the idea that sort of believing that God is always present and sort of continuing to create for us and provide, especially because we think of the light of Havdalah as being something that we need, or something that we truly benefit from. To me, that sort of idea of constant creation, makes a lot of sense. Anyone else? Sandra.
Well, I wonder if something like this could be changeable with the times. Like the people going through the Holocaust would say, well, God created the light in the past, but God is no longer present. And then maybe now we could say God is back creating.
Yeah, I mean, it's a quite deep theological statement if you view it that way, that there are times in our lives where God is creating and times in our lives when God isn't creating. That's kind of that's sort of its own theology, right? To believe that God is sort of coming in and out of our lives in that way, as opposed to God is present whether God's causing good or bad, right? So just depends on your view of God, I guess. Right? I don't know that everybody would agree that God wasn't present in the Holocaust, I guess is what I'm saying, right? I mean,
well, a lot of people thought so. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Of course, especially if you yourself were there, it would be hard to believe God, right? But we know of stories of people having their Passover seders and things like that, even during the Holocaust, with like sort of remain connected to tradition and remain connected to God. And so I'm not sure everyone would make that argument, but certainly that's a personal statement and a personal theology. Anyone else? Okay. I think we're going to stop a few minutes early because I don't think we'll have time to get through the next one. We got through a lot this morning, and it's about to get a little more interesting. I think that one was our shifting towards the end of this chapter, which we'll probably get to next. Next week is MLK, actually, so we're not going to meet next week, but we'll get to next time and probably finish off. Here, I can unshare my screen so you can see. Probably finish off chapter 8, and then we have only one chapter to go, and then we'll have to see what happens from there.
Well, have you given any thought to what we're going to study next?